The wind on Zephra 9 never stopped moving. It wasn't like Earth's wind, which could be gentle or wild. On this planet, the air seemed alive, breathing across the landscape like a sentient creature, always whispering, always watching. The cadets had just disembarked from their transport vessel, boots crunching against violet sand and curling grasses that recoiled at the slightest touch. High above them, swirling gas bands in the planet's upper atmosphere colored the sky in hues of jade and gold, making the daylight look like something half-remembered from a dream. Mira Lang adjusted her pack and stepped forward behind her squad, a mixture of alien cadets taller and broader than she was. The instructors had chosen this moon for the annual Galactic Command's cross-species leadership trial, a brutal 5-day simulation designed to test cooperation, command ability, and adaptability under real planetary conditions. Teams were made up of cadets from different worlds, and each team was led by a designated cadet commander. Mira wasn't one of them. She was human, the only one on her team, and the lowest ranked in terms of status. That suited her just fine. She didn't need the attention. Her assigned team was called Aurochs 6, composed of 6 members. The team's leader was Commander Verzan, a towering insectoid from the Jarelian colony worlds. His compound eyes flickered constantly with data streams, and his chest bore a holographic sigil marking his top-tier academy status. To him, leadership was simple. Follow data, consult algorithms, execute without emotion. Mira had observed him during training simulations. He never once asked anyone's opinion unless it came from a statistics board or a feedback monitor. The instructors gave a short final briefing before dispersing across the terrain to observe. "Your goal," said Commander Thaleen, a feline Karathi with a voice like rusted silk, "is to survive, assess threats, and lead your team to the marked recovery zone by day 5. No direct interference will be provided. Your decisions are your own. Good luck." Mira watched the instructors vanish into the haze of the plains, the long grasses swallowing them whole. The moment they were gone, Verzan began barking orders. His voice sounded like chitin rubbing on glass, unpleasant and sharp. "Deploy atmospheric scanners. Begin perimeter analysis. Establish base metrics for weather prediction. Lang, you will manage logistics. Do not speak unless consulted." She nodded silently. Mira didn't argue. She knew how to blend in, how to stay invisible. Let the others underestimate her. That had been the pattern her entire life. She moved to the side and unpacked the survival gear, taking inventory by hand while her teammates activated scanners, triangulators, and comms beacons. For a few hours, things ran smoothly. The team erected a small base using collapsible shelters. Data poured in from their devices. Temperature gradients, wind charts, cloud humidity readings, everything pointed to stable conditions. But Mira felt something else. It wasn't just a gut feeling, it was the air. The taste of it on her tongue had changed, just slightly, more metallic, more charged. The wind had shifted from its usual swirling dance to something more purposeful, more direct. She tilted her head and looked up. The clouds overhead had begun to harden their shapes, moving less like scattered tufts and more like heavy ships pushing against one another. No storm signals were coming from the alien tech, but Mira didn't trust machines as much as she trusted patterns she'd learned on Earth years ago. Her grandfather had been a farmer, a quiet man who never owned a weather monitor in his life, but always knew when the sky was going to break. He'd taught her to look for silence in the birds, tension in the trees, and the bitter scent of ozone on the wind. Mira had ignored that part of herself for years while training with the Galactic Command, until now. "Commander," she said, finally speaking, "I think a storm might be coming. We should reinforce the shelters." Verzan turned his head toward her slowly, blinking once. "Incorrect. Atmospheric data indicates no major instability. No action required." "But the wind has shifted," she replied, trying to stay respectful. The cloud behavior is— You were not consulted, he interrupted. Return to your assignment. Mira clenched her jaw but said nothing more. She returned to the logistics zone and sat down, staring out across the plains. A few others glanced at her but didn't intervene. Some were probably amused. A few might have even agreed with her but didn't dare contradict the commander. Mira pulled her jacket tighter and continued watching the sky. The clouds were thickening now, forming long arcs like serpent coils. The air had gone still, unnaturally so. Even the buzzing insects had gone quiet. She stood up and walked to the edge of camp, kneeling near a patch of cracked soil. She scooped some dust into her palm and let it fall slowly. The grains dropped vertically for half a second, then abruptly swerved left as if pulled by an unseen hand. She watched it happen 3 times. The wind was shifting again, lower, tighter, forming a spiral. Inside the command tent, the team continued reading charts and recalibrating sensors. Mira knew the data wouldn't help them now. This planet had its own rules, and those rules didn't care for alien sensors. She moved behind one of the shelters and quietly began collecting materials. Thick plant stalks with waxy surfaces, hardened soil bricks from beneath the surface layer. She began shaping them into a half-dome, low to the ground, facing away from the direction the wind was starting to rise. It wasn't much, but it might hold, just enough to shield 1 or 2 people if the weather turned. A small part of her hoped she was wrong, but her instincts told her otherwise. As night approached, the light turned strange, like staring through a stained glass window lit from behind by fire. Verzan called the team to rest. No anomalies detected. Continue primary rotation schedule. Sleep in standard shifts. Mira didn't sleep. She sat inside her improvised windbreak, listening. The grasses were whispering faster now, not like before. A dry heat had begun to rise from the ground, and the scent of the air had fully transformed. It wasn't just metallic now, it was electric, as if the sky were breathing in, holding its breath before the scream. She looked back at the others sleeping in their standard tents, oblivious and trusting in their technology. And then she whispered to herself the words her grandfather once told her under a dying maple tree, just before a tornado hit the fields. If the air goes quiet and the animals vanish, get low and don't wait for proof. Mira closed her eyes. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming, and it wouldn't ask for permission. The sky cracked without warning. Mira didn't need a sensor to know it had begun. She felt it in the vibration under her fingertips, pressed to the ground beside her shelter wall. It came like a pulse through the earth, one long shudder, followed by a distant rumble that was too deep to be thunder and too steady to be wind. She lifted her head. A single bright vein of sky fire arced across the horizon, a streak of emerald lightning far too low and too fast. It disappeared behind a bank of clouds that had thickened into something monstrous. She rose to her feet and ran toward the main encampment, boots kicking up flecks of glowing dust as the wind gained weight behind her. The alien grasses, normally restless but gentle, now bent flat to the ground. She reached the cluster of shelters where the others were still asleep, or trying to be. The tent flaps beat like wings. A few cadets stirred inside, muttering in different dialects. None of them had alarms. None of them had checked the sky. She grabbed the first tent's flap and threw it open. "Wake up," she said, not loud, not panicked, just firm. "Something's wrong, you need to get up now." A violet-skinned cadet blinked at her through vertical pupils, confused. "What?" "The commander didn't—" Mira didn't wait. She moved to the next shelter and repeated her warning. This time she didn't explain, just yanked the flap open and said, "Up. Now." By the third tent, the wind hit the camp like a wall. Shelters shook. Lightweight gear scattered. Then the clouds opened, not with rain, but with sharp particles of electrified vapor that hissed as they landed. Mira ducked and shielded her face as flecks of it hit her jacket and burned through the outer layer like acid. Now the cadets were running. Some were shouting, others were scanning their non-functioning wrist monitors. The team's primary command tent collapsed under the pressure of a downburst, the poles snapping clean. Verzan stumbled out, disoriented, blinking furiously as his ocular display flickered and went black. "Status update," he demanded, shouting over the howl. "Sensors are down. Comms are non-responsive." "No shit," one cadet muttered under his breath. Mira moved fast. She ducked into the ruins of the command tent and pulled out a heat-resistant tarp and half a spool of binding fiber. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't try to rally anyone. She just acted. She ran back to her windbreak and reinforced the entrance with the tarp, pressing the bindings into the ground with stakes she'd sharpened from metal brackets earlier that day. Then she looked up. The clouds weren't moving anymore. They had settled directly over the camp, spinning in silence. No lightning, no thunder, just that charged, acidic mist that scoured every surface it touched. Visibility dropped to 10 meters. Mira squinted through the blur and spotted one of the cadets wandering aimlessly, shouting the name of a squad mate who was probably no more than 20 steps away, but might as well have been on another continent. She ran toward him. "Get low!" she shouted. "Don't stand upright. You'll get hit by skyfire." He hesitated, unsure if he should listen to her. But she didn't wait. She grabbed his arm and yanked him down. A second later, a jagged bolt of light cracked through the fog and struck the ground right where he'd been. He looked at her, wide-eyed, and nodded. She led him to her shelter and pushed him inside. Another cadet was already there, one of the quiet ones who had helped her earlier. He didn't speak. He just shifted to make room. Outside, the storm intensified. A sound began, distant and mechanical, like metal scraping against metal. Mira realized it was the cry of the shelters being peeled apart by wind shears. The fabrics weren't built for this. None of the structures were. The Galactic Command had trained the cadets to expect predictable danger, measured threats, controllable events. But this wasn't designed. This was nature, raw and hostile. Verzan's voice broke through the chaos again, distorted through a handheld speaker unit. "All units, regroup to the central beacon." Mira turned her head sharply. She could barely see the beacon's pulsing light through the haze, and it was moving, flickering, unstable. If anyone tried to regroup there, they'd be standing in the most exposed part of the terrain. She stood up and headed in that direction anyway. She found Verzan crouched beside the broken beacon, his hands frantically trying to reroute power through exposed wires. "This is our anchor point," he said when she reached him. "We must re-establish command." "No one's following you," she answered. "That signal will draw fire. This is the protocol." "The storm doesn't care about protocol," she snapped. "We need to move low and find natural cover. There's a ridge to the west. The windbreak curves around it. It's the only thing that hasn't been ripped apart." He stared at her, mandibles twitching. His eyes were no longer projecting data. For the first time since she'd met him, his gaze was empty. "I said move," she repeated. She didn't wait for him to obey. She ran. It wasn't easy. The storm didn't let up. Acid mist continued to fall, and every few minutes a bolt of sky fire slammed into the ground somewhere nearby, spraying hot rock and smoke. She stayed crouched, weaving between debris and low grasses, guiding cadets she found along the way with hand signals and quiet commands. Some followed without hesitation. Others paused, afraid to trust her. But the alternative was to be alone, and none of them wanted that. By the time she returned to the windbreak, there were 5 cadets behind her. 2 were bleeding from shallow wounds. 1 had lost her entire kit. Mira got them inside, applied pressure where needed, and sealed the shelter tighter. There wasn't room for everyone to lie down, so they huddled together, pressing knees against ribs, heads bowed against the sides of the dome. It was a long hour. Then another. The wind outside shrieked like something in pain. At one point, the entire shelter trembled violently as a nearby strike split a tree down its core. Mira didn't speak. She just kept her hand on the wall, reading the vibrations like Braille. She was listening, not for sound, but for a change in the rhythm. A sign that the storm was ending. It didn't end, but it shifted. The mist began to lessen. The brightness of the sky faded to something more gray than green. The air was still thick, still full of electric threat, but no longer actively trying to rip the world apart. Mira exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. She crawled outside. The grasses were flattened for hundreds of meters. Most of the original shelters were destroyed. The beacon was gone. Verzan sat 10 meters away, knees drawn up, arms limp. He looked at her without recognition. "The shelters you told us to build," he said slowly, "were wrong." She didn't answer. Not yet. There were still cadets out there, unaccounted for. She stood in the ruined light and looked west, toward the darker horizon where the storm had rolled from. Something told her this wasn't the last one, and the instructors hadn't shown up, which meant the test wasn't over. It had only just begun. Mira walked alone into the flattened fields of Zephra 9, scanning the broken silhouettes of shelter fragments, half-buried packs, and scorched clumps of vegetation. The acidic mist had thinned, but it had left scars across the land like a warning written in ash. A sharp tang still lingered in the air, catching in her throat and clinging to her tongue like the aftertaste of burned metal. She kept her hand at waist height, letting her fingers brush over the bent grass stalks, feeling their texture, the way they pointed, not just flattened, but pressed in one direction like compass needles. She crouched and placed her palm against the soil. It was warm. Not from sunlight, but from friction. The storm hadn't been an isolated burst. Something under the ground had reacted. Heated, maybe even stirred. Her instincts whispered that the weather here was more than climate. It was movement, pressure. Something in the core of the planet itself shifted before the surface responded. She had no device to confirm it, but her body knew what it felt. The way her bones ached now was too familiar. She'd felt it once before on Earth, the day before a mudslide buried her neighbor's entire farm. When she stood again, she saw a line of tracks cutting through the grime. A pair of boot marks, staggered and deep, veering northwest toward the edge of the ridge. She followed them at a steady pace, slowing only when she spotted a dark shape slumped against a slope. It was a cadet, collapsed but breathing, a burn mark streaking across his lower leg. She knelt beside him, examined the wound, and tore a strip from her undershirt to bind it. He opened his eyes briefly, recognition flickering in them. "I followed light," he muttered. She nodded. "You're safe now." "Is the storm gone?" "Number just sleeping." She didn't carry him back. She gave him her water capsule and told him to rest, then moved to locate more survivors. One by one, she found 2 others, one curled under a fragment of drone wing, the other half submerged in a hollow where the acid runoff had pooled. Mira guided them to the shelter silently, gesturing rather than speaking. The sky was still too unstable, too electric. Voices carried in strange ways here, bouncing and bending unnaturally. She trusted her feet, not her voice. By the time she returned, the shelter was overcrowded. Cadets sat shoulder to shoulder, arms wrapped around knees, watching her like someone who knew something they didn't. Mira stepped just inside, scanned the space, and nodded once. "Keep your breath low," she said softly. "Don't lean against the wall. It's soaked through." No one argued, not even the higher-ranked males who had ignored her earlier. She lowered herself near the entrance and stared out through a small gap in the structure. The wind had shifted again. It wasn't violent anymore. It was curious, swirling lightly around the dome like it was trying to understand who had defied it. She listened, not just with her ears, but with her whole body. the cadence of the gusts, the rhythm of pressure. Her grandfather had taught her to hear a storm like music, to track the key change before the crescendo. She felt it coming again, not a full return, but a test. The planet was feeling out its opponents. Mira knew the others would want answers soon. Verzan was still outside, sitting apart from the group, his gaze unfocused. He hadn't spoken since the storm paused. He hadn't moved either. She considered speaking to him, but dismissed the thought. What mattered now wasn't rank, but action. She exited the shelter again and climbed the ridge in silence. At the top, she turned her face into the breeze. The scent had changed once more, cleaner now, sharp, like flint struck against steel. She picked up a blade of broken grass and held it to the wind. It curved east. The last time, it had blown from the west. She crouched and scooped up a handful of dirt. Beneath the surface layer, the soil was warm, warmer than it should be. The heat was rising again. She descended quickly, moving toward a section of land with natural indentations, small craters or erosion basins scattered across the field. That would be her new focus. She examined their shape, their slope, their orientation. Then she began to work. Using a shard of shelter support, she dug into the side of one crater, widening its mouth into a half-tube. Then she added windbreak walls with remaining tarp material she scavenged from destroyed equipment. She reinforced the roof with stone fragments, slathered the seams with mud to seal it, and punched 3 small holes into the side for airflow. It would channel the wind through and keep pressure from collapsing the roof again. This one wouldn't just survive a storm, it would use the storm's own energy to keep standing. Her hands were blistered by the time she finished. She didn't notice until blood ran down her palm and into the dirt. She sat back on her heels and exhaled. Behind her, she heard slow footsteps. She turned to see one of the older cadets, Tovan, a reptilian humanoid with wide-set eyes and gray-tinted scales, watching her from a cautious distance. He spoke first. "We thought you were trained in logistics." "I was," she replied, not looking at him. "Then I untrained myself." He stepped closer. "How did you know?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up a stone and held it to her cheek. "On Earth, storms talk," she said finally. "They don't always shout. Sometimes they whisper. You learn the difference if you want to stay alive." He looked at the shelter she built, then back at her hands. "We're listening now." She stood, wiped her palms on her trousers, and nodded. "Good, because this planet hasn't finished." That night, the second wave came. Not as loud, not as fast, but colder. The mist thickened again, and the wind spiraled downward in tight columns that spun like drills, boring into the soil. Mira directed the cadets into the new crater shelters. She stationed Tovan at one and another cadet named Rila at the other. They followed her instructions without question. The shelters held. The air inside was breathable, dry, and warm enough to prevent shock. No one panicked. No one ran. When the sun rose, dull and watery through the planet's thick sky, Mira walked among the shelters, checking the supports, replacing mud seals, redistributing rations. She found Verzan still seated near the ruins of the command tent, legs folded, eyes open, but distant. His armor was streaked with ash. His hands rested motionless on his knees. She approached slowly. "Commander." He didn't respond. "Verzan." His compound eyes focused slowly on her face. "I failed the test," he said, voice low. "No," she replied. "You just studied the wrong subject." He blinked, the gesture slower than usual. "Then what's the subject now?" She looked past him at the horizon where the wind had begun to move in new directions. "Adaptation." She turned and walked away, already thinking about where the next shelter needed to be, already sensing the temperature drop that would signal the next shift. The planet wasn't done, but neither was she. And this time, Everyone would be ready. By midday, the light above the plains had turned a pale ochre, casting an eerie sheen across the ridges and hollows. Mira stood at the edge of the last shelter she had reinforced, her eyes scanning the sky not for color but for motion. Spirals, breaks, inward folds. Something wasn't right. The air, which had been hot with subtle electric pulses earlier, now held an unnatural calmness that made her jaw clench. The birds that had returned briefly during the early morning had disappeared again. Even the ground insects that usually flickered underfoot were nowhere to be seen. The silence pressed against her like a warning. She turned her gaze to the northwest, where the terrain sloped upward into a series of jagged outcroppings. Something about the shape of the land disturbed her. The patterns of erosion didn't match the wind's direction from the previous nights. The rocks bore scorch marks that weren't from lightning, but from heat. Intense, pulsing heat. Mira descended into the shelter and retrieved her grandfather's knife, the one piece of earth she had carried with her through every training cycle. It had a worn wooden handle and a slightly curved blade. Not useful for cutting modern alloys, but excellent for slicing branches and roots, things that still obeyed old, natural rules. She headed toward the rocks without informing the others. She wasn't keeping secrets. She just didn't want to waste time. Verzon remained at the base camp, mostly silent, but no longer frozen. He watched her leave, his gaze following her movements. But he didn't speak. She knew he was waiting for confirmation of whatever haunted him, waiting to see whether his complete loss of control had truly meant something or if this was all some grotesque exception to protocol. As Mira climbed the outcroppings, the wind shifted again. This time it blew upward from the ground, rising through fissures in short, unnatural bursts. She paused, knelt, and held her hand over a vent in the stone. The heat was back. But it wasn't just rising from the sun-baked surface. It came from below, like a furnace slowly exhaling through a narrow crack. Her fingers brushed the edges of the stone, and she felt the sharp rhythm of vibrations. Small, consistent, almost like the thrum of buried engines. She looked up. The sky had gone opaque, no longer glowing, just dull and thick, as if the planet had draped itself in wet cloth. She stood slowly, dusted her hands, and turned to head back when the sound began. Not thunder, not wind, a low-frequency hum that came from all directions at once, too deep for any organic creature to produce and too organic to be machinery. She froze. Her ears strained. It wasn't a single tone. It pulsed in layers like a chorus of groaning tectonic plates. A sudden flash cut through the sky. Not lightning, but a wide beam of concentrated energy, white-hot and silent, that tore across the eastern plain and struck the ridge below the shelters. Mira gasped and dropped to the ground instinctively. A second later, a wave of pressure slammed into her chest, throwing grit into her mouth and ears. She rolled behind a boulder and covered her head as shards of flaming grass and ash sprayed through the air. She didn't know how long she stayed there. The light was gone when she opened her eyes. A strange blue fog drifted above the ground. It glowed at the edges and clung to her skin like wet static. Her ears rang. Her body trembled. She rose slowly, every muscle tight, and looked down toward the shelter basin. It was chaos. One of the reinforced craters had collapsed. The makeshift roof had been scorched clean off. Several cadets were scrambling across the ground, some screaming, others dragging unconscious bodies toward cover. Mira didn't hesitate. She descended the ridge in a controlled sprint, her boots slipping on the ash-covered slope. Her heart pounded with each step. The wind now came in long, diagonal gusts, carrying the fog like shreds of cloth, wrapping it around everything it touched. She reached the lower shelter and saw Tovan crawling out, a deep cut on his forehead. She gripped his shoulder, helped him stand, and pointed toward the nearest intact shelter. He nodded and stumbled away. Another cadet, One of the younger females from the Thresk species clutched her arm, which had blistered badly from exposure to whatever the fog carried. Mira tore fabric from her sleeve and wrapped the burn, whispering instructions as she moved her toward safety. A second blast split the air, this one vertical, slamming into the edge of the ridge she had just climbed. It exploded inward, leaving a cylindrical crater that hissed and spat molten dust into the wind. Mira ducked, pulling the injured cadet with her behind the remains of a supply crate. Her mind raced. This wasn't natural. Not even Zephra's erratic climate could explain targeted strikes of that intensity. The pattern had changed. The storm wasn't just wild anymore. It was reacting. She turned to scan the horizon. Nothing visible. No drones, no ships, no visible weapons. Just clouds, massive, thick clouds hanging like curtains above the plain. But deep within them, Mira saw something shift. A light. A flicker. Then nothing. The others began to regroup. Rilla limped forward, half carrying another male cadet. Verzan emerged last, his armor scorched, but his posture finally restored. He approached Mira, crouched beside her, and looked her directly in the eye. "This is beyond us," he said. "No," she replied firmly. "It's not beyond adaptation." He didn't argue. Instead, he followed her as she pointed toward a lower stretch of the plain, one that had natural trenches winding through it like veins. If the strikes continued, only a subterranean approach would work. She needed depth, not shelter. Cover, not protection. They worked in silence. Verzan helped move debris. Tovan reinforced the tunnel entrances with stone and bone-like roots they pulled from the nearby trees. Mira organized the cadets by task, digging, sealing, treating wounds, rotating watch shifts. She took no breaks. Her hands bled openly now, but she didn't notice. Her brain lived 1 hour ahead of her body, already anticipating the next move. When darkness fell, no one asked if the instructors would intervene. Everyone knew the answer. This was no longer a simulation, or perhaps it never was. Perhaps this was the simulation, leadership in the face of planetary-scale hostility, leadership without the illusion of control. Mira sat at the entrance of the deepest tunnel, her back pressed to the packed wall. The others were inside, resting, repairing, surviving. Verzan sat beside her, silent. She whispered, "The planet is watching us." He nodded slowly. "And you're watching it back." She didn't respond, because she was, and she intended to win the staring contest. The tunnels breathed with quiet. Mira sat in the shallowest curve, knees drawn up, her fingers caked in dried earth and blood, her jaw tight with a tension she no longer tried to hide. A fine dust floated in the air, suspended like memory, clinging to her skin and lashes. She had not slept, not even for moments. There was no room in her mind for rest, not until she knew this was truly the end. The planet was quiet again, but the quiet felt less like a reprieve and more like a final inhale before judgment. The cadets moved inside the trench system like shadows. Every step was careful, measured. Rilla checked the last of the burns. Tovan reinforced the stone-lined archways with new bracing. Mira watched them without words. She had said all that needed saying earlier. Her voice had changed, hoarser, lower, more deliberate. Every syllable now seemed to weigh more. Every glance from the others lingered longer. Even Verzan, who had once dismissed her as a statistical anomaly, now stood nearby with an unspoken question in his eyes, waiting for her to decide what came next. She stood slowly, joints protesting, and walked out into the open air. The wind had flattened again. The acidic bite had lifted. Above, the clouds had scattered into heavy strips of bruised gray and orange. The ground steamed faintly where heat still radiated from beneath. But no more pulses shook the earth. The strikes had stopped completely. Mira raised her hand and held it to the wind, felt its motion like breath on her skin. It was cold now, unsettlingly cold, but still. The kind of stillness that came only after something had run out of energy. A faint sound broke the silence, a low, whirring hum, soft at first, then swelling. Mira turned toward the sky and spotted a descending shadow in the upper atmosphere. A transport vessel, its reflective surface already catching the light as it cut through the planet's layers like a falling blade. Behind it, two smaller drones followed in slow spirals. The instructors were coming. Finally. But too late to mean anything. She didn't move. She waited. The others emerged behind her, one by one, standing in a loose line. Verzan stopped at her right side. He didn't speak. He just waited with her. When the vessel landed with a smooth exhalation of heat, the hatch opened, and a trio of galactic command observers stepped out, cloaked in storm-proof plating and bearing the silver insignia of Training Division Oversight. One of them, an Andarian male with deep green skin and a ridged neck, stepped forward and scanned the group with silent appraisal. No one saluted. Mira remained still, dust coating her shoulders like a second uniform. The man spoke, his voice thin and metallic through his helmet. There was a fault in the remote monitoring grid. We lost visibility for 32 hours. No one responded. He looked at Verzan. You are the designated team commander. Submit report. Verzan turned his gaze toward Mira. She stepped forward. There is no report, she said. You weren't here. The Andarian narrowed his eyes. Cadet, protocol was followed, she interrupted, until it became useless. After that, survival dictated its own rules. The second observer, a tall woman with a crystalline helm, shifted her weight. Casualties? None dead, Mira answered. 3 with severe injuries, 7 with minor burns or lacerations, 1 in neural shock. I stabilized him. He's recovering. You? The woman asked. Yes. I trained as field medical support before I was rerouted to logistics. The Andarian male looked past her to the smoking horizon, then back at the cadets. And who issued the order to abandon standard shelters? I did. Your rank? None that mattered. The silence that followed was long. Mira didn't break eye contact. She didn't offer more. Behind her, Rilla coughed softly but said nothing. Verzan's shoulders were square, his hands loose at his sides. The third observer, a smaller being with translucent skin and large golden eyes, stepped forward at last. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the air like a scalpel. You coordinated all defensive structures during the anomalous storm event? Mira nodded. You led all tactical relocation? Yes. You kept your team alive. Mira didn't speak. The golden-eyed woman gave a small, slow nod. Under Protocol 7C, cadet performance evaluations during interrupted oversight revert to internal leadership hierarchy. Command shifts according to function, not designation. The Andarian stiffened. She passed, the woman said. And not as a cadet. Mira didn't react. Not outwardly. But her chest expanded slightly, as if her lungs had finally accepted air for the first time in 2 days. The tension in her jaw remained, though. There was no victory in surviving what never should have been unleashed. The observers turned and boarded the transport again. The hatch sealed. The drones hovered once, scanned the terrain, then disappeared into the clouds. The cadets stood motionless in the gathering dusk. Verzan finally moved. He stepped in front of Mira and lowered his head, not deeply, not formally, but with genuine intent. You led us, he said. She met his eyes. I didn't ask to. Neither does the storm. She didn't reply. Back at the trench, Mira gathered her gear, what remained of it, the knife, the torn water capsule, a shard of her old tent folded into a makeshift pouch. She tied it at her side and stood at the edge of the basin, looking once more at the ridgeline that had nearly become her grave. The planet had gone quiet again, but not tamed. Just resting. Zephra didn't yield. It tolerated. She turned toward the rest of the team who waited in a wide semicircle. "I'm not staying in command," she said. "This was enough." No one argued. "You'll get promoted," Rilla said quietly. Mira shook her head. "I didn't survive this to climb." "Then why?" Tovan asked. She looked up at the sky, which had begun to clear in patches, revealing stars that shimmered like metal dust. "To prove we can outlisten the noise." She walked away first, her step steady, her shoulders light with the burden she had earned and chosen not to keep. The wind stirred again behind her, not violently, not cruelly, just a whisper across the scarred ground. The planet watched her leave, and this time it said nothing.